low vision or have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Dick Shanley, and for the next hour I will be reading from Sunday's January 26th issue of the New York Times opinion section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. This article was written by Maureen Dowd. I saw the charismatic Italian conductor Gianandrea Nocito lead the National Symphony Orchestra on Thursday in a program called Songs of Destiny and Fate. The Brahms, Bach, and Vivaldi were a soothing tonic to President Trump's soundtrack, which is akin to the stabbing, shrieking Bernard Herrmann score for Hitchcock's Psycho shower scene. The concert began with the Star-Spangled Banner, even before Trump blasphemously interloped into the Kennedy Center's name. Horrible Trump cultural war enforcer Rick Grenell had dictated that the National Symphony Orchestra concerts began with the national anthem. I'm always happy to put my hand on my heart and listen to the ode to our flag and this heaven-rescued land. My dad always had an American flag flying, took it down at sundown as a sign of respect, which was the custom then. When I won a Pulitzer, New York's very cool Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan sent me a flag that had flown over the Capitol, which I cherish. But it felt tinny to be force-fed the Star-Spangled Banner by our solipsistic president and his creepy sycophants. Editorial comment, solipsistic, solipsistic, a new word. I don't really know what it means. So, who shows nothing but disdain for the Constitution and American values. It was our country's destiny to reflect ideals that made us an incandescent beacon for democracy. But Trump has pulverized these ideas. We are now seen as sinister, selfish, unruly, and at everybody's throat. Jack Smith's testimony before Congress on Thursday was a stinging reminder that Trump tried to overthrow the government and wickedly put lawmakers and his own vice president in harm's way. Our investigation revealed that Donald Trump is the person who caused January 6th, that it was foreseeable to him that he sought to exploit the violence, Smith said. It is heartbreaking that on the cusp of our 250th anniversary, we have a president who is perverting all the values our country was founded on, looking out for one another, respecting one another's rights. America is not supposed to be a place where an angel-faced 5-year-old named Liam with a floppy-eared hat and a Spider-Man backpack gets seized and taken to a detention center by men in masks. The American leader is meant to be a unifier, a strong and soothing presence in the world. Trump is an anarchic toddler, constantly causing upheaval across the globe, transgressing and remaking everything in his helter-skelter image. He has no interest in fireside chats. He wants to set the fires. He's more about droit du seigneur than noblesse oblige. He feels entitled to whatever he wants, from Greenland to Canada to the Kennedy Center to a Nobel Prize he didn't win. Unlike previous presidents, he isn't countering Russia. He's catering to it. He disparaged the NATO troops who died for us in Afghanistan and belittled our nicest neighbor, claiming that Canada lives because of the United States. Demanding Greenland, which he kept calling Iceland, He winked to global leaders at Davos. All I want is a piece of ice. The depths of his shallowness is infinite. One Canadian columnist asked, how would Trump behave differently if he were legitimately losing his mind? I understand the importance of legal immigration. My Irish dad fought in the infantry in World War I to earn his citizenship. Nobody wants illegal criminals here. President Joe Biden let the border run amok. But in the New York Times Siena University poll, a sizable majority said ICE had gone too far. Trump responded by saying he would expand his lawsuit against the Times to include the poll because his rampaging vanity cannot accept falling numbers. The poll indicated that 42% of voters said he was rampaging up to one of the worst presidents in American history. We have watched the horror as Minneapolis has morphed into an eerie war zone. ICE claiming that its officers are allowed to barge into people's homes without judicial warrants. An ICE agent shooting an unarmed man with stuffed animals in her glove compartment 3 times until she was dead. ICE dragging a Minnesota man, a hung among HMONG immigrant, naturalized U.S. citizen with no criminal record, out of his house into the snow wearing only underwear and Crocs. ICE detaining 4 children, including little Liam, from one school district. An FBI agent who wanted to investigate the ICE agent who shot the mom resigned after Bureau officials told her to stop her inquiry. Why detain a 5-year-old? A flustered Zena Stethnick, the town superintendent, keened at a press conference. It is clear the crowd sees no difference between a criminal who crossed into the country illegally and a family that has applied for asylum and is doing everything the right way to stay here. My parents inculcated us with patriotism and gratitude for this country. I grew up surrounded by men in uniform. My mom carried around a pocket-sized Constitution in her purse, along with miniature bottles of Tabasco. She did not want to see us on July 4th if we were not in red, white, and blue. I know what America is meant to stand for. Trump has made America un-American. The Carney Doctrine, written by David French. There will be more twists and turns, highs and lows, but I'm afraid it's time to recognize a sad reality. It's over. This week, 2 things happened that, taken together, send a clear signal to the United States and the world. The American-led alliance of democracy is in the midst of a rupture. We have broken faith with our allies, and our allies are choosing resistance over submission to Trump's aggression and greed. Before we get to the dramatic developments in Davos, Switzerland, let's set the stage. On Sunday night, we learned that President Trump sent to Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Store a message that can only be described as deranged and delusional. You may have read it before, but please read it again. Dear Jonas, it began, considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars, plus I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace, although it will always be predominant, but I can now think about what is good and proper for the United States of America. Trump, incredibly enough, was tying his desire to acquire Greenland to the Nobel's committees, awarding someone else the Nobel Peace Prize, a decision that he wrongly attributed to the government of Norway. Making everything worse, even as Trump is behaving in a demonstratively irrational way, America's vaunted checks and balances are failing. Impeachment and conviction are off the table. There's no chance that Trump's cabinet of sycophants would invoke the 25th Amendment. Congress is led by invertebrates, with many of them apparently convinced that he'll subjugate the world in much the same way that he subjugated them, through threats and bluster and the unyielding support of millions in the MAGA mob. On Tuesday, however, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, said no. He delivered what might be the most important address of Trump's second term so far. To enthusiastic applause in Davos, he articulated a vision of how the middle powers, nations like Canada, should respond to the great powers. It is decidedly not according to Trump's plan. First, Carney spoke the plain truth. For decades, Carney said, countries like Canada prospered on what we call the rules-based international order. We joined its institutions, we praised its principles, we benefited from its predictability, and because of that, we could pursue values-based foreign policy under its protection. But Carney said this order was always partially false. We knew that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically, and we know that international law applies with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. Even an imperfect system had profound benefits as long as America remained both strong and virtuous. American hegemony, in particular, he said, helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. That all appears to be over. We're not in the state of transition, but rather one of rupture. That's Carney's word for it, and he's right. This declaration might seem bracing or perhaps even premature. The system is under strain, yes, but ruptured, really? We could be mere months away from a decisive repudiation of Trump and Trumpism in the midterms. Shouldn't that reassure our allies? Besides Trump, doesn't Trump backtrack all the time? Didn't he just turn down the temperature over Greenland? But consider the reality from an allied perspective. They now know that there is considerable appetite in the American population for at least some form of Trumpism. They know that one of the two American parties is firmly in the hands of people, including Vice President J.D. Vance, who may even be more hostile to NATO than Trump himself. They have watched as former Trump opponents, men like Marco Rubio, have been assimilated into the MAGA machine. As long as this is true, that means Western alliance will always be precarious. You cannot build an enduring economic order or a stable defense strategy when chaos and confusion are always one election away. Turns out that the much maligned post-war consensus provided many benefits to America and the world. The Trump theory, to the extent there is a coherent theory, is that America's economic and military might means that will benefit from this rupture will no longer be exploited by freeloading allies. And their own weakness means that we can impose our will through tariffs and threats. We can even extort territorial changes, acquiring Greenland from Denmark, and who knows, perhaps even turning Canada into the 51st state. Our strength used to be their strength, and now our strength is their weakness, a weakness we can exploit. Carney sees this reality clearly. Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. Integration, he said, has become the source of subordination. And so the choice is clear. Submit or resist. Carney did not receive a rousing standing ovation because he called for submission. Instead, he marked out a path to allied integration and cooperation that could create, in essence, a new great power, rival to the United States. Submission, in fact, was never an option. Proud nations do not agree to become vassals. And so the choice isn't between resistance and submission, but between forms of resistance. Whether the middle powers would create national fortresses or enter the new alliance and agreements that don't include the United States. Carney, in essence, says yes to both. Canada, he said, is doubling its military spending and rebuilding its defense industrial base, but is also entering into an array of new agreements, including, most troubling to the United States, agreements with China and Qatar. But what does this mean for Trump's ambitions for Greenland? Carney could not have been more clear. On Arctic sovereignty, we stand firmly with Greenland and Denmark and fully support their unique right to determine Greenland's future. Our commitment to Article 5 is unwavering. In other words, if Denmark calls for aid in the event of American aggression, Canada will answer, and the standing ovation indicated that other nations would as well. Carney's conclusion was clear. The powerful have their power, but we have something too. The capacity to stop pretending, to name reality, build our strength at home, and to act together. I'm afraid the years of mockery of allied nations and allied strength have led millions of Americans into a profound error, where we believe that Europe and other liberal democracies are easily cowed and bullied. Incredibly, there are powerful people in the administration who seem to believe that we'll be stronger and more prosperous when we finally freed of the anchor of European weakness and wokeness. This critique was grounded in a measure of truth. Many of the great nations of Europe, Germany most notably, allowed their defenses to decay after the Cold War. Europe did seem intimidated by Putin. The European response to Russian aggression in Ukraine in 2014 was wholly inadequate. It was necessary for American presidents to coax our allies into spending more on our shared defense. But what began as an appropriate bipartisan movement to persuade key allies to increase their military spending has now morphed into contempt for our allies and for our alliances. This is profoundly foolish. If the middle powers answer Carney's call, they could form an economic and defense alliance that rivals American power. Combine the economies of the European Union, countries like the United Kingdom and Canada, and the militaries of the key European nations, you have a nuclear-armed defense and industrial alliance cannot simply be cowed into submission. There's an analogy to Putin's miscalculations regarding Ukraine. He, too, saw the West as woke and weak. He apparently thought his soldiers would just march into Kiev, yet his brutal invasion awakened the Ukraine's marital courage, and it shocked Europe out of its complacency. Now Trump is doing much the same thing. He demands for Greenland and attempts to intimidate Canada, and doing his bidding are eerily reminiscent of Putin demands for Crimea accomplished, and his ongoing attempt to turn Ukraine into a vassal state. How is any of this in America's interest? How does replacing friends and allies with friendlies and rivals make America more secure? How does engineering enmity with some of the most prosperous nations in the world guarantee American prosperity? On Tuesday, Mark Carney called Donald Trump's bluff. Trump wants subjects, but he's getting rivals, and the American people will pay the price. Some other things I did. My Sunday column was about the killing of Renee Good and how Congress and the Supreme Court have created a zone of immunity for federal officials that allows them to commit acts of violence and oppression with impunity. In Federalist number 51, James Madison wrote some of the most famous words of the American founding. If men were angels, no government would be necessary, Madison wrote. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige is to control itself. This is a version of the ancient question: who will watch the watchers? Madison's next words were crucial. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control of the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. In the Trump era, these auxiliary precautions have utterly failed. They have been undermined to the point where the reverse is now true. Rather than providing additional precautions against the rise of authoritarian rule, American law and precedent seems to presume that angels govern men, and these angels would be free to do even more good if only they possessed a free hand. My Saturday roundtable with Jamel Bowie and Michelle Kodal is focused on the midterms. Will there be a blue wave in November? Depends almost entirely on what voters think of the president. Part of the issue and one of the problems you're going to have in analyzing this election is, as we said at the very top of this, these midterms are mainly verdicts on the president. And so running for things like affordability or building more housing, those are the kitchen table issues that voters want to hear about. Also, at the same time, when you don't have the presidency, it's very hard to implement an agenda. It's very hard to run, and this is the agenda we're going to implement if you vote for us. It's much easier to run, here's all the crap we're going to stop. So in some ways, I think you're going to have is to go back to this analogy, a break glass in the case of an emergency sort of election where you're saying, we are in an emergency situation right now. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of rage. There's a lot of anger. And we're going to be able to at least provide some accountability and some restraint that doesn't exist right now. I think that's going to be a very compelling top-line message. On immigration, the GOP finds itself in a shocking place on defense. Since President Trump's rise, the issue has been a strength for the party. But now, after the chaos in Minnesota, Democrats see an opening that some Republicans worry that Mr. Trump is going too far. 2 killings by federal agents on icy streets of Minneapolis have suddenly turned the politics of immigration upside down. Republicans, led by a president who rose to power with promise to build a southern border wall and carry out mass deportations, are now trying to dodge an issue that polls had long shown to be a strength for the Democrats. Democrats, who have for years tried to change the political subject to health care or abortion rights, are now racing to talk about immigration and harness their voters' rage over the fatal shootings in Minnesota. The shift could be fleeting. American politics has rarely felt so unsettled and unpredictable, with President Trump just as responsive to television coverage as to the on-ground realities. On Monday, he shook up the leadership of his immigration crackdown and seemed inclined to try to calm tensions, least for now. The island that actually matters to American interest, by Nicholas Kristof. Editorial comments, he's one of my favorites. While President Trump seemed to threaten military action this month in Greenland over a national security crisis that no one else could see, he has been nonchalant about a far more serious risk of war in the Taiwan Strait in ways that elevate the peril. Late last month, China launched missiles around Taiwan in live-fire military exercise that looked like a practice run for a blockade of the island. Major countries, including Britain, Germany, and France, promptly called on China to grow up, though a bit more diplomatically. There was one conspicuous absence: the United States. Trump downplayed China's military exercise. It wasn't until days after they had wrapped up that Trump administration issued a statement from just a Deputy State Department spokesperson expressing concern. All of which raises a question. If Trump can't even respond promptly to a straightforward provocation by China, What hope is there he would respond decisively if President Xi Jinping of China actually attacked Taiwan? And another question, does Trump's passivity increase the risk that Xi will reckless actions toward Taiwan? As I wrote in a recent column from Taiwan, of all the calamities that might befall the world in the coming decade or so, a war in the Taiwan Strait would be among the worst. It would risk an exchange of nuclear weapons between the United States and China. Wars are expensive in every way, albeit deterrence is a bargain. And while deterrence will depend heavily on Taiwan's political will, Trump should be doing everything possible to convey to Xi that China would face devastating costs if it attacked Taiwan. Alas, Trump seems to be doing the opposite, signaling to Xi something closer to a yawn. That's up to him, what he's going to be doing, Trump said in an interview with Times this month, referring to how it's XI, I'm pronouncing it Z. I don't know if that's correct, but you know who I'm talking about. Might handle Taiwan, but I've expressed to him that I would be very unhappy if he did that, and I don't think he'll do that. I hope he doesn't. That was a shockingly mild response, and it contrasted with the concern in Trump's own Defense Department. Annual Samuel Paparo of the Indo-Pacific Command warned last spring that Beijing's aggressiveness maneuvers around Taiwan are not just exercises, they are just rehearsals for a forced unification. And again, last month, the Pentagon issued a major report warning about China's gains in military power, including cyberspace and nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence, and asserting that China expects to be able to fight and win a war on Taiwan by the end of 2027. That may be alarmist, but my view is that Xi would much prefer to avoid war. But he's hard to gauge, and Trump's seeming lack of interest in the topic surely plays into Xi's calculations of the cost and benefits of aggression against Taiwan. Ko Chen-Hang, a longtime Taiwan security official who now leads a military think tank in Taipei, told me that the Chinese generals are probably sobered by Trump's decisiveness in attacking Venezuela and by the ease with which American forces foiled Chinese-made radar systems in Venezuela. But Ko also noted that Trump's mild reaction to China's military exercises may encourage China, Russia, and North Korea to test America in the Pacific. If a test is underway, I fear Trump is failing it. And some in Taiwan are nervous that Trump's desire to make his April summit with Xi a diplomatic triumph will lead him to casually make concessions that damage Taiwan's security. Trump's puzzling deference to Xi has been a display over the last 2 months, but as Beijing has undertaken a frenzied campaign against Japan. The campaign began after Chinese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi indicated that her country might respond militarily if China used force against Taiwan. If you stick that filthy neck where it doesn't belong, it's going to get sliced off, a Chinese diplomat publicly warned Japan. Any normal president would have called Takaichi to show support. Instead, Trump had a call with Xi and then reportedly advised Japan to pipe down. This felt like a betrayal of an essential to deterring Chinese aggression. Why should we care about Taiwan? For starters, it's now arguably the most democratic place in Asia, and it would be better if it didn't fall under a rival nation's oppressive thumb. More broadly, Taiwan manufactures most of the world's advanced chips, so a war might trigger a prolonged global depression and deprive the U.S. economy and military of critical inputs. In addition, Taiwan is part of the first island chain that limits China's ability to project power across the Pacific, so its loss would be an immense setback for American military, political, and economic influence. The United States traditionally has declined to say whether it would defend Taiwan from a Chinese invasion, but the policy of strategic ambiguity oscillates with the president. and Trump seems much less inclined to protect Taiwan than some of his predecessors. To the Trump administration's credit, in December, it announced an $11 billion arms sale to Taiwan, a huge package that will help in deterrence. But overall, I fear that Trump has projected a dangerous weakness. One reason for Trump's diffidence may be his dismissal of Taiwan as a tiny island, far less significant than China. Another may be vulnerability. Americans don't seem to understand how much Xi outmaneuvered Trump in 2005. Trump started a trade war with Beijing, and Xi responded to Trump's tariffs by restricting exports of rare earth elements, forcing American surrender and leaving Trump, in effect, on a Chinese leash. In 1996, President Bill Clinton dispatched 2 aircraft carriers, strike groups, to support Taiwan during a crisis, but Trump knows that if he made a similar move, China would most likely cut off rare earths and hobble the American economy. So instead of America's deterring China from aggression against Taiwan, Xi may be deterring Trump from deterring Trump from defending Taiwan. Trump should take 2 critical steps to boost deterrence. First is to ensure that Russia losses in Ukraine or pays a staggerously high price. If Xi saw the world united behind strong anti-Russian sanctions and asset confiscations, as well as overwhelming support for Ukraine that made Moscow likely to lose, he would hesitate to attack Taiwan. Second, the United States should cultivate friends that would stand with us in a conflict over Taiwan. President Joe Biden knit together Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia for that purpose. It would also help to have friendly countries ready to sanction China and to support a blockade of Chinese shipping through the Lamacca Straits. Trump is taking neither step, of course, and by chasing a fantasy in Greenland and seemingly running away from Taiwan, he elevates the risk of an actual nightmare war. It's so hard not to be consumed by rage. James Baldwin once said that to be black in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage almost all the time. In the present moment, that sense of frustration can extend to much of its populace. We are right to be deeply disturbed by the actions of ICE over the past few months, especially the use of lethal force against Renee Good. But there is a danger to anger, one that I have learned about through personal experience. Growing up, I had good reason to loathe my father. He was abusive and struggled with addiction. He cycled in and out of jail, and that sent my family tumbling down the economic ladder. Before he died, when I was in my mid-30s, I realized that my sense of my own righteousness had calloused into something cruel. I didn't want him to change because his poor behavior formed a central part of my identity. He left his family, I built one. He was addicted to drugs, I rarely drink alcohol. As long as I compare myself with him in this way, I needed his brokenness to provide direction. I was not running toward the good, I was fleeing him. I have thought on my feelings about my dad repeatedly as I have navigated the past decade of Trumpian politics, and I have often struggled with deep anger at the unfolding injustices. I feel less safe in President Trump's America. I worry that my children, whose complexion is fairer than mine, might get stopped by the ICE agents who have been an ominous presence in the Midwest, where I live these past several months. I feel for people who have been detained and who report having been denied due process to humane conditions in detention centers. But I also worry that for some of us, our antipathy to Trump has, like my disdain for my dad, become part of who we are. And it can say something of personal poison. I find myself being angry and simply looking for fellowship among other infuriated citizens. There's a community that is formed not by hope, but by loathing. And I'm not sure it's any different on the other side of the political divide. I remember the day that my father apologized to me. We hadn't spoken in years, but we're now reunited at my sister's wedding. During a lull in the rehearsal, I asked him a question that had been with me my whole life. Why did you live? And why did you stay away? He replied, son, I don't rightly know. After I left, I saw that you all were doing better without me, so I stayed away. I'm sorry. In the coming months, he would have similar conversations with my mom and my siblings. What shocked me most was how difficult it was to accept this new version of him, even as he tried to make amends. Who was I if I wasn't a person with a wicked father? I was confronted with a miracle that I was not sure I wanted. Forgiving my dad forced me to create a positive and not merely a reactive vision of my life. It also taught the valuable lesson that not all causes are irredeemably lost. If everything changed and majority of Americans decided to vote for politicians who promised to remove ICE from our streets, could we forgive? If there were a real attempt at righting the wrongs that have been done to some people in this country, would that offer a path toward healing for all of us? Have we become too comfortable in our national malice toward one another? Do we want repentance or revenge? I died a few years after that apology, and my family asked me, a member of the clergy, to perform the ceremony. I am an Anglican priest, and the Book of Common Prayer provides a recommended list of texts to preach at funerals. I broke from that list and preached about the Pharisees and the tax collector, who feature in a parable in the Gospel of Luke, my oldest childless namesake. In that narrative, the two men go up to the temple to pray. As a Pharisee, the first man adhered to Jewish law, an expression of faith and devotion. Tax collectors use violence and coercion to take from their own people to line the Roman colonizers' pockets. Pharisee says, God, I think that I am not like other people, robbers and evildoers and adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, give a tenth all I got. The tax collector, by contrast, humbles himself. He stands at a distance and beats his chest, saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. The story turns expectation on its head, because it is the low tax collector who, troubled by the things he has done, received mercy from God. I told the congregation that I had been like the Pharisee, so caught up in self-justification I failed to view my dad with compassion. I did not see him as someone lost or trapped by his wrongs. I saw him as someone whom I couldn't wait for God to judge. He had been on a spiritual and moral journey that I could not see. What if some in the MAGA movement are trapped, just like the tax collector or my dad? Does any IC officer think, after watching a colleague drag a woman out of her car or use tear gas on civilians, this is not what I signed up for? Are none of them moved after seeing the harsh treatment of largely peaceful protesters and the arrest of clergy? I refuse to believe that there are no troubled souls in the whole of MAGA. I am a pastor and a public theologian. By vocation, I have a duty to hope. To hope as a Christian is never to concede that wickedness must be the end of any person's or any nation's story. To hope is not simply accepting a false peace and laments divisions without naming the evils done. Instead, hope demands a certain doggedness, a refusal to let go. The same patience that God showed me must in principle be available to others. Mutual hatred is a national wound that we will have to work to heal, and that requires letting go of whom we have become. It's the only way toward all of us. Why independent voters are not necessarily moderate. In 2004, the percentage of Americans identifying as political independents hit the lowest point since Gallup began regularly tracking party ID in 1988. That year, only 31% said they were independent, while Republicans and Democrats were evenly matched among those choosing a party. That percentage has risen to a record high today, a whopping 45%, according to Gallup. It was Republican ID that collapsed first, caused by the souring over the Iraq War, and the election of Barack Obama, followed by rising disaffiliation from the Democratic Party a few years later. Republicans and Democrats are once again at almost even levels, with 27% of Americans choosing each one in ways that are increasingly ideologically aligned. The percentage of Republicans also think of themselves as conservative or very conservative is now at a record of 77%. Democrats have also shifted sharply away from moderation in recent years, with 59% identifying themselves as liberal or very liberal, also a record high. As the parties have been moved to the edges, it can feel like a yawning political chasm has been left in the wake. To so many Americans are independent and the two parties are increasingly extreme, why hasn't a third major party sprung up? Why aren't there many independents getting elected? To understand what record high independent ID means, it's important first to remember what independent is not. These days, it does not necessarily signify moderation or centrist. Fewer than half the independents today consider themselves moderate in the Gallup data, with 27% identifying as conservative or very conservative, and 24% identifying as liberal or very liberal. Plenty of people who are independent declare themselves as such because they find that both parties ideologically unsatisfactory, not because they fit somewhere in the middle. The political scientists Lee Drotman and William Galston and Todd Lindbergh have highlighted in their research that among those who wish there were a third party, there is little consensus around whether that party ought to be truly centrist or whether to what flank the existing parties on the left or right. This sort of finding dovetails with the long-held political science theory that people who declare themselves independent are often partisans in disguise, with most leaning one way or the other. In the 2024 election, while the Pew Research Center found itself identified independents broke evenly between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, many of those independents acknowledged they were generally lean more toward one party or another. Of those who said they lean more toward the GOP, 87% voted for Mr. Trump, while 91% of Democratic leaning voted for Ms. Harris. Voters may initially tell a pollster like me that they are independents, but in truth, they behave much more like the Republican Democratic brethren when they get to the ballot box. In my own surveys, most voters who identify as independents do go on and press to say that they lean more toward one party than the other. Ultimately, I find that only 9% of voters firmly insist they do not pick one side more often than the other. This could prove especially relevant this year as we head into the midterm election, in which primaries are the key and are dominated by firm partisans. Persuadable independents are often an afterthought to political campaigns that are more concerned with turning out their base voters. Though many independents may vote like fairly loyal partisans, there are clearly reasons they don't want to put on the red or blue team jersey. For some, aligning with the party may feel that doing so is making a statement about who they are. At a time when the parties are far from beloved, in my data, people who identify with one party or another or who define themselves as conservative or liberal are more likely to say politics is important to their identity. There's another reason independents get less attention and lower turnout elections, including midterms. I consistently find independents are less likely to say they are motivated or likely to vote. It's also true that many Americans identify as independent for reasons having little to do with ideology, a movement, or a candidate. They simply may feel disaffected from one institution to general. As the political scientist Yulia Azari told me, her work finds a strong connection between institutional distrust and negative attitudes about political parties. In my own data, I find my self-identified independents are more likely than Republicans, Democrats, that most politicians are corrupt or just looking out for their own interest. It is precisely this kind of disaffection that may be driving young people away from both parties. Majorities of Generation Z and millennial respondents identify themselves as independents, in contrast to those of older generations, more likely to choose one party or another. In the Gallup data, it is the youngest respondents who are responsible for the rise in independent ID over the decades. Gallup's Jeffrey Jones notes that 56% of Gen Z adults identify as independents today. This compares with 47% of millennials of Gen X adults in 92. Whereas people might normally move toward a political party as they age, millennials have remained persistently independent, and GS follows suit. Rising political independent ID does not mean our country is moving toward moderation or centrism. For a host of structural reasons, it does not necessarily herald the dawn of a thriving third party, but it does signal that something feels rotten with the way our system currently works, and that voters, especially young voters, do not want to associate with institutions they feel are not delivering. I've covered police abuse for 20 years. What ICE is doing differently. Police agencies in the United States kill more than 1,000 people each year. After many of these deaths, the agency involved put out statements. These statements often use what's known as the exonerative voice to minimize officers' involvement. The first statement from the Minneapolis Police Department after George Floyd's death, for example, said that the officers at the scene noted that he appeared to be suffering from medical distress. Quite the understatement. These communications often cast events in a light most favorable to the officers involved, sometimes to the point of deception. Too often, they try to smear the deceased by citing a criminal record or suggesting a drug addiction or gang affiliation. I have been covering policing for more than 20 years and have read and praised and parsed a lot of these statements. The Department of Homeland Security's response after the Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent Jonathan Rauch shot and killed Renee Good in Minneapolis this month is something else entirely. For all their flaws, typical communications from police officials usually include a modicum of solemnity. There are assurances that there will be a fair and impartial investigation, even if those investigations too often turn out to be neither. There's at least the acknowledgement that to take a human life is a profound and serious thing. The Trump administration's response to Ms. Good's death made no such concessions. There was no promise of an impartial investigation. There was no regret or remorse. There was little empathy for her family, for her parents, her partner, or the children she left behind. From the moment the world learned about her death, the administration pronounced the shooting not only justified, but an act of heroism, worthy of praise and celebration. It isn't just the lying, it's that the lies are widely exaggerated and easily refutable. All the evidence we've seen so far, including a meticulous Times forensic analysis of the available footage, makes clear that at worst, Ms. Good mightily obstructed immigration enforcement, disobeyed ambiguous orders, perhaps attempted to flee an arrest. None of these are capital crimes, nor do law enforcement officers get to dole out punishment in such cases. At one point, President Trump justified her shooting by claiming she'd been very disrespectful to immigration officers. That isn't a crime at all. The lies the administration is telling about Ms. Good aren't those you deploy as part of a cover-up. They're those you use when you want to show you can get away with anything. They're a projection of power. In the past decade or so, since the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, America has engaged in a high-stake dialogue about police abuse and accountability, the militarization of law enforcement, and the push and pull between public safety and civil liberties. Those discussions, while occasionally heated, have been based on a shared understanding that the primary job of domestic law enforcement is to serve the public. What Mr. Trump is doing with federal immigration forces has rendered those debates obsolete. The surge of federal forces into Minneapolis, like smaller earlier into Los Angeles, Portland, Washington, and Chicago, isn't about law enforcement at all. It's about an administration declaring, explicitly at times, that the purpose of federal law enforcement isn't to uphold the law or promote public safety, but to enforce the will of a single man. We started to see this in the way the Trump administration responded to previous shootings by immigration officers, including of Carlitos Ricardo Perez in Los Angeles and Miramar Martinez in Chicago. Administration officials quickly declared those shootings justified and righteous, with hyperbolic language similar to that used by Miss Gooding's killing. These claims would also be later disproved by witness accounts and other evidence. The government eventually dropped the charge against Miss Martinez. A judge dismissed Mr. Perez's charges with prejudice, meaning they can't be brought again. In fact, nearly all the administration response to the deaths in custody, shootings, or other accusation of abuses have used maximalist language to venerate immigration officers, dehumanize their victims, and villainize anyone who doesn't support the Trump administration. There are no disinterested parties, no innocent bystanders. People are either criminal immigrants or radical leftists who deserve what happens to them, or they are heroic, patriotic federal cops incapable of mistakes. There's no humanity for the civilians and no humility for the officers. Last week, after federal agents dragged Alea Rahman, a U.S. citizen, from her car and arrested her, Department of Homeland Security referred to her as an agitator who was obstructing immigration operations. In fact, she was trying to get to a doctor's appointment at the Traumatic Brain Injury Center when immigration officers used pepper spray and possibly flash grenades on a vehicle with a family inside, sending 3 children to the hospital. The department posted to social media. It's horrific to see radical agitators bring children to violent riots. Please stop endangering your children. The family was headed home from a child's basketball game. In addition to such language, the administration has embraced fear tactics, long associated with totalitarian regimes. Until now, law enforcement officers in the U.S. rarely mask their faces, save for during especially operations like SWAT raids. For host agency, this isn't a written policy. It's just been accepted that mass policing isn't consistent with a democratic society. We want law enforcement to see themselves as accountable to the community, and we want community members to see officers as approachable so they'll cooperate. Masks undermine both. They instill fear in the community and encourage a menacing aura of infallibility among officers. Instilling fear is a drawback only if your goal is public safety. This administration has made it clear it doesn't want marginalized communities, immigrants, Somali, U.S. citizens, residents of Latino neighborhoods, and so on, to feel safe. It wants them living in fear. This is why they mask. It's why they shatter car windows. It's why Stephen Miller, the architect of Mr. Trump's immigration agenda, went on cable news to assure federal immigration officers incorrectly that they have complete immunity from criminal or civil liability. And why? After Mrs. Good's death. Department of Homeland Security social media accounts reiterated Mr. Miller's claim. The administration has resurrected tactics that professional police forces have deemed dangerous or counterproductive. ProPublica recently reported on 40 incidents over the past year in which federal immigration officers used potentially fatal chokeholds that are banned by most police agencies. Federal agents have shot into cars at least 10 times since September. This too is prohibited by most big city police, in part because it's too easy to mistake a driver's intent. Videos from cities where Mr. Trump has sent federal agents have shown attempting to stop fast-moving vehicles with techniques that most police departments prohibit or reserve for rare confrontations involving exceptionally dangerous people. They are now being used against people suspected of immigration violations who are irritating officers with their protests. Mr. Ross was involved in a previous incident in which he reached into a car and used a stun gun on a person while the car was in motion. Reckless tactics that should have gotten him fired. It's clear that immigration officials are routinely breaking the law. There's persuasive evidence that they've been explicitly racially profiling people in Minneapolis and elsewhere. The Supreme Court effectively permitted profiling people by race and other factors in the September ruling. They've been requiring U.S. citizens to produce proof of their citizenship on demand, also a violation of federal law. As we've seen U.S. citizens dragged from their cars and homes and workplaces, then arrested or detained. You have been listening to a reading of articles and features from January 26th issue of the New York Times opinion section. We read from the New York Times opinion section every Sunday at 2 p.m. Your reader has been Dick Shanley, and thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section, followed at 4 by a rebroadcast of this morning's Buffalo News. Please stay for these readings and more throughout the day, and feel free to contact us with your comments, suggestions, with any questions you may have. following program is intended for listeners who are blind.